Say then about the social justice coalition case. What is apparent from both the judgments, social justice coalition as well as the Makwikana case, is that it is possible to derive an unlisted ground, but deriving an unlisted ground must itself be linked to a listed ground. In Makwikana, it was the intersectionality of African street traders and the discrimination based on race. In the social justice coalition case, it was the unfair distribution of resources to black townships. And the court specifically makes the point about innate characteristics. So factors like geography, of course, may be taken into account. But the reason we take those factors into account is because of the very purpose to Section 9 of the Constitution. The point of Section 9 of the Constitution was that the country was drawing a decisive break with the past that was based on inequality. And we know what the basis of inequality under apartheid was. It was race, it was gender, it was sex, etc. That is why those grounds were chosen. So one cannot now impose arbitrarily chosen grounds where there is absolutely no evidence of the group or the category having suffered systemic discrimination in the past. One cannot simply choose today that I want journalists to be a protected category, because there is just no linkage to Section 9 as a ground of discrimination. And I don't want to repeat the submissions we made yesterday about the dangers and the risks of choosing profession by profession for protection. And the social justice coalition case, we say it's particularly instructive, especially because it is a full bench judgment of the Western Cape High Court. Could I then move to the second topic of my address? Your Ladyship remembers that yesterday I took the court through the speech that was made, the 20 November speech made by Mr. Malema outside of the Justice Zondo Commission. What also happened is that our learned friend relied directly on the tweets that were shown on the EFF Twitter page as Mr. Malema was talking. And it was somehow suggested that if you read those tweets, the way the speech was tweeted by the EFF, that could somehow create an impression that Section 10 was violated. It's important to go through those tweets. There are 4 of them. They start at page 29 up to 32. The first one at page 29. Now this is the EFF itself speaking. The first one is, let us attack fighters. Where we meet the enemy, we must crush the enemy. When the enemy raises its ugly head, don't hit the head, cut the head. That is at 4:24 p.m. Shortly thereafter, at page 30 is the next tweet, where Mr. Malema names Bruce, Dupree, Munusami, Hafaji, Mokudu, Gasa, and DeForce, and says those are the Ramaphosa Defense Force. I've shown your Ladyship the context in which this was said. But if you look at 31, and again, it's a couple of minutes later, I think it is 2 minutes after the tweet at page 30. This is what Malema is quoted as saying. Everywhere you see their names, you must attend to them decisively. But look at what's tweeted next. They are no different to Bell Pottinger, who was hired as a machine for the Guptas and the Zumas. That immediately shows you, if anyone reads this and they know Bell Pottinger was a spin doctor, a propagandist. The criticism is that these journalists are propagandists. That may be an unfair criticism, because these journalists may be doing their work honestly. But it's not hate speech. At page 32, the last tweet appears. Mr. Malema is quoted. These people I'm mentioning by name. You must engage them in a civilized manner and not violently. And then he expressly explains what the position of the EFF is on violence. Violence is for those who are empty in the head. The EFF thrives on superior logic. So if you read these tweets that were intended to transpose the speech, the dominant impression is that there is a criticism of identified journalists for behaving like Bell Pottinger. In other words, for being propagandists. We will also get the clear impression that Mr. Malema is expressly opposed to violence, and that the EFF, its mode of engagement, is what he calls superior logic. It is only by lifting paragraph page 29 out of context that you get to the outcome that Mr. Berger urged upon the court. But that simply goes against logic, and that goes against authority by the Supreme Court of Appeals. And so, neither the speech itself nor the manner in which it was treated gives you any impression at the level of interpretation that this was hate speech. The argument goes further from our learned friends. It says, forget about the 20th of November speech. Look at the subsequent conduct of the EFF. Here, my lady, we must draw a distinction. Your ladyship remembers in my opening remarks, I said that I'm going to argue to your ladyship that the law does not impose liability on the EFF in respect of speech made by other people. It imposes liability on the EFF in relation to speech it itself makes. This is clear from the provisions of Section 10 itself. We don't have to go beyond Section 10 because this is a Section 10 inquiry. We go to Section 10, which is at page 69 of the Bundle of Authority. The opening line of 10.1, subject to the proviso in Section 12, no person may publish, propagate, advocate, or communicate. The prohibition there is on the person publishing, on the person propagating, on the person advocating, on the person communicating words. It's not indirect or derivative. The prohibition is the EFF may not publish, propagate, advocate, or communicate words. If the words are communicated by someone else, the prohibition is against that other person, not against the EFF. The same applies to harassment, which is in Section 11. No person may subject any person to harassment. It is a direct prohibition against the conduct of the EFF, a direct prohibition against the communication of words by the EFF. We listened yesterday to our learned friend, hoping that we would get authority for the proposition that this act, in Section 10 in particular, must be read to mean that the EFF is also responsible for the conduct of third parties. We got none. In circumstances where it is expressly pleaded in the answering affidavit that the EFF denies responsibility for the conduct of unauthorized Twitter bots that are abusing people online. So, we have to get the law right on this. The prohibition is against the EFF. It is not against a derivative, third party, unknown, unidentified, and unidentifiable. It does not help for our learned friends to read out online abuse that emanates from third parties. Those third parties must take responsibility for abusing journalists. What is wrong is the scapegoating of the EFF. So, what did the EFF actually do? This again is not difficult because we have the evidence of what the EFF did. Let's look at the EFF tweets. The first one is at page 51. And this is from the president, Mr. Malema. And this is in the context where SANEF is asking for a meeting with the EFF. And what SANEF does is not just to write a letter to the EFF privately. It tweets about it publicly. And you cannot expect in those circumstances that Mr. Malema is not going to respond by a tweet. Because if you look at page 51, the fourth tweet, SANEF publicizes on Twitter the fact that it has asked the EFF for a meeting. There's no need for that. What Mr. Malema then does is to respond immediately in kind. I'm prepared to meet you on condition you do not bring racist things like this young white boy called Adrian Basol. Now, if we look at this, we just have to compare it with what the SCA said in Masuku. To call someone racist is not hate speech. Page 60. It's page 60, my lady, I am told, of the band of authorities. Where they specifically say racism. It is 59, my lady, sorry, paragraph 26. So if you look at 59, paragraph 26, now this is where Mr. Masuku had called white people racist. They complained about that as well and called others Zionists. This is what Dambuza J.A. states. Further, none of the other offending terms, specifically racists, fascists, and friends of Hitler, either on their own or within the statement, connote religion or ethnicity. The terms may be irrational, offensive even, and even insulting. Threatening or unsavory words in the statement, such as bitter medicine and perpetual suffering, are only metaphorical. Mr. Malema has told your leadership that when he spoke of chopping people's heads, or chopping the head of the enemy, not a person's head, that was metaphorical speech. This is not the first time this has happened. It has been accepted by the Supreme Court of Appeal. And the reason why this continues being made is that we have to be tolerant of speech, tolerant of robust speech, because we prize freedom of expression in Section 16. So there is nothing wrong in Mr. Malema refusing to meet with SANEF, and of course responding publicly to them, because they themselves put the fact of their request for a meeting in a public platform. What are they trying to do? To embarrass the EFF? And so the fact that Mr. Basol was called racist is neither here nor there. In any event, his complaint is not that he was discriminated against on the grounds of race. His complaint is that he was discriminated against on the grounds of his occupation. And we know for a fact that the mere fact that he is attacked or accused of racism is in fact on its own not hate speech. The next, yes, my colleague points out that in his affidavit, Mr. Basol complains that he was defamed by Mr. Malema. That may be, but that simply shows that he has a right to institute a defamatory claim against him. We were told that they have no alternative remedies. Well, defamatory claim is one of them. We look at...
You've spoken about direct correlation in Section 10.1's consent, but Mr. Baker relied heavily on the Brown matter.
Yes, I will come to Brown. But in fact, I can tell you, your leadership, now what the argument on Brown is. Reliance on Brown is really misconceived, because Brown was concerned with the electoral code. The electoral code imposes a duty on the EFF to make sure that it polices its supporters. And that is why it was found in Brown that the EFF had violated the electoral code because it failed to say no to its supporters. And this is why one cannot rely on authority outside context. We have to look at what Section 10 does. This is a Section 10 case. It's not an electoral code dispute. And it's not a defamation case. We look then at what the EFF does. And again, we have to make sure that we are confined with the EFF, because that is the statutory prohibition. At page 62, Ms. Hafaji says, Malema says in his speech, and the EFF turns it into a tweet which goes viral, we get attacked by EFF trolling army. It happens every day. One smack like this, it's open season. This must end. That is Ms. Hafaji. Now we know that Ms. Hafaji is not part of this case at all. We also know on the affidavit of Mr. Malema that Ms. Hafaji in fact attends EFF press conferences. And when she is there, she engages with the EFF. What Mr. Malema then says is it won't end. You are Ramaphosa Defense Force. Just start acting professionally, it will end automatically. But what is he talking about? Malema says in his speech, that is what Ms. Hafaji says. Mr. Malema is entitled to say, I am not going to stop. Because what Ms. Hafaji is asking is that the EFF must stop saying these things in their speech. And he is entitled to say it won't end. And the reason he says it won't end is perfectly aligned to his original complaint that certain journalists have positioned themselves to defend President Ramaphosa and to defend Minister Gordon. Mr. Malema may be wrong for all we know, but he is entitled to position those journalists as part and parcel of the Ramaphosa Defense Force. And then the next line, just start acting professionally, it will end automatically. Of course, he says, my own conduct in labeling you as Ramaphosa Defense Force will end if I no longer perceive you to be the Ramaphosa Defense Force. We are then told that now you must focus on the EFF trolling army. But if you want to establish a case under Section 10, the trolling army is irrelevant because the imposition is directly on the EFF. If anyone pretends to be an EFF supporter and then starts abusing journalists, that person must be brought to court. The next tweet is from Mr. Shivambu. And your ladyship will recall that we are deliberately selecting EFF tweets so that if your ladyship looks at the EFF tweets and says these are in violation of Section 10, of course you must issue an order. But what we are objecting to is the idea of confusing all of these tweets and treating them as if they were one and the same, without drawing any distinction between what the EFF has actually said. So the Deputy President of the EFF at page 63 says, this is now in response to Ms. Van Wyk. He says, I think a lawsuit against a confused, conflicted, and drowning young investigative journalist like Polly Van Wyk will be tantamount to killing an ant with a 6-inch hammer. But here are the most important words. Forget about the first portion on superior logic. The Deputy President says, we dismiss and clarify these types with facts. We demand concrete facts, and once we do that, they fall on their swords. No one sensibly can say that amounts to hate speech. At page 64, Mr. Shivambu appears again. He is responding to a tweet by Bongani Bingwa, which says, there are growing calls to no longer take EFF public addresses live, but to preview and fact-check them, and also to edit them to exclude incitement and violence and defamation. Good call or censorship? So if your lordship just looks at that, there is a discussion that the EFF must be censored beforehand. When they speak, you must not do what you do to the DA or the ANC, where you allow everyone to speak without prior editing. For the EFF, You must first view the video. Whatever you deem as incitement, exclude. Whatever you deem as defamation, exclude. There is a call for the censorship of the EFF. Mr. Shivambu responds to that tweet when he says, so the madness of Max du Preez is a growing call now. The EFF doesn't need the media to carry out events and articulations live. We have adequate capacity through social media platforms to reach out to our people directly. Rational media platforms will also not comply with madness. Of course, this is tough language, this is hard words, but perfectly understandable in the context where the very existence of the EFF is threatened by the conduct of the media, which wants to pre-screen everything it says, and then take out what it doesn't like or what it considers to be defamatory. And Mr. Shivambu's response is actually a fairly neutral response, because this is about squeezing the air out of the EFF. Mr. Malema reappears at page 87 in response to Ms. Munusami. Now, this was a debate about what had happened in Parliament around Mr. Ismail Momoniat. And then Ms. Munusami says, if you do not know who Ismail Momoniat is, ask. There are many people, even people you might consider to be inferior like me, who could help you. Happy to help anytime, sir. You see, my lady, the journalists routinely communicate on Twitter, not news, but social discussion, political discussion on Twitter. They're not publishing a newspaper. Mr. Malema then responds, we know him very well, and we also know why he is treated special by those who do not respect, who have no respect for African leadership and African colleagues. Again, this is a neutral statement. He is simply complaining that Mr. Momoniat either has no respect for African leadership, or people who have no respect for African leadership treat him specially. Mr. Malema, again, is at page 88. He's talking to Mr. Shivambu, when Mr. Shivambu tries to engage his point about clarifying cogently with facts. Mr. Malema says, don't over-explain yourself, my brother, Floyd Shivambu, to embedded journalists who have made it their business to misunderstand us, but prepared for worse because you touch the untouchables and the favorites of the media. That again is a neutral statement. He's simply saying, don't waste your time trying to explain yourself to journalists because they will deliberately misunderstand you. At page 89, this is now the Deputy President. I've shown your leadership tweets coming from the President and the Deputy President. I'll come to others, I'll come from other leaders of the EFF, and you will see all of them. There is absolutely nothing hateful in their tweets. It says, we know we have hit the nerve, even when those who pretended to be neutral journalists throw the toys and go on full defense and baseless exoneration of one individual who evidently micromanages national treasury. Fact is, he undermines Africans. Again, that statement is perfectly neutral and perfectly legitimate. Then at page 99 is a tweet by Lee Matthys, who is the treasurer of the EFF. She is responding to Ms. Nomboniso Gasa, who says, nothing stops the EFF from seeking remedy in courts. Then the response is, and nothing stops us either from calling out the inconsistencies in Pauli van Wyk articles. As she does her job, we must be allowed to do ours, and our response will be determined by us. So again, we have another, this is now a third leader of the EFF, explaining the position of the EFF. We are entitled to call out what the journalists are saying. There was an emphasis placed in the tweet at page 140 by Mr. Malema. Now, this was a reply to Ms. van Wyk who stated that the EFF, Mr. Malema must take responsibility for violence meted out to journalists. He's stoking the flames of the campaign against journalists whose work he disputes and ultimately endanger the lives of journalists. Mr. Malema says, "You are sick, go to hell, Satan." And that was read out yesterday explicitly. Of course, that could be construed crude, that could be construed insulting. And of course, it could be construed as even offensive. But it's not hate speech under Section 10 of the Equality Act. It's certainly not the hate speech that the applicants are contending for, which is discrimination on the grounds of profession. So to insult someone by telling them they are sick and they must go to hell is not hate speech. It's an insult. And it is absolutely essential to draw these distinctions. And they have been drawn for us, luckily, by the Supreme Court of Appeal. And if your leadership just has regard to the words that were in the Masuku case that were held not to constitute hate speech, they are at page 55, at paragraph 6. Where Mr. Masuku spoke about subjecting people to perpetual suffering until they withdraw from Palestine. And the response of the Supreme Court of Appeal to that, at page 26, paragraph 59, saying these offending terms, yes, page 59, paragraph 26, the terms may be irrational, offensive, or insulting. But that has nothing to do with hate speech. And nothing more needs to be said about that tweet. The fact of the matter is that it does not reference the journalism, it doesn't reference any of the prohibited grounds under Section 10 of the Equality Act. At 141, Mr. Shivambu speaks in response to Ms. Van Wyk, and he says, "Laughable fishing expedition, Mrs. Lakay." Well, that's it, a laughable fishing expedition. There was also reference to the tweet by Mr. Mpofu, Advocate Mpofu, at page 142. And let's look at that tweet. Remember what happened. At page 148, Ms. Van Wyk has done her job as a journalist. She has sent questions to the EFF on email. She is concerned that there is no response. She doesn't write an email to the EFF asking for a response. She tweets about it, telling the whole world. She says, "I've sent a few questions, read the illicit VBS, to yourself, Mbuseni and Jose, on Monday, and that you haven't answered. Advocate Mpofu, just a reminder." At 142, this is Mr. Mpofu's reply. "So, does that give you license to publish blue lies and fantasy about me?" And we know the article, it refers to Mr. Mpofu having something to do with the patients of the house. And he says that's blue lies and fantasy. "I've not seen any questions from you." He's responding to the tweet from Ms. Van Wyk. "You never called me." Again, he's rebutting what Ms. Van Wyk is saying publicly. This is put by Ms. Van Wyk on Twitter. And then says, "Like you, I work for a living. I'm not your garden boy who must jump at the exact time that you feel like doing your day job. Understanding." There is nothing hateful here in terms of Section 10 of the Equality Act. The first two passages are a perfect response to, why are you putting this on Twitter? If you say you've sent an email to the EFF, there is no reason to then tweet about it. And to say that I'm not your garden boy and I don't have to jump at the same time as you has nothing to do with discrimination on the grounds of race or abuse on the grounds of race. Say you are behaving like a madam. That's the accusation. And Mr. Mpofu is the chairperson, national chairperson of the EFF. At page 148, Mr. Mpofu appears again. He has responded at page 147, and at 148, immediately after the tweet from Ms. Van Wyk, he says, actually, if you read the rubbish article carefully, it's a dishonest retraction of the claim that 10 million VBS money went to Floyd personally. We challenge her to prove it. We are still waiting. Again, this is a public response because things that should have been done on email have been put on a public platform. And what he is saying here is that you are dishonestly retracting the accusation that was false that Mr. Shivambu got 10 million rands from VBS. And then the next one from the leadership is at page 153. And this is from Mr. Museni Ndozi, who is the national spokesperson of the EFF. And you will see, Your Ladyship, that this is a response from Ms. Van Wyk, who says, again, let's just correct the distortion. It is EFF people stealing from the EFF and its constituency. The EFF is not some unparticipating victim that woke up robbed. And Mr. Ndozi says, this is a story about people who are stealing from EFF, yet Sunday Times, with its malicious headline, seeks to create an impression that EFF is caught with their hands in the cookie jar. And nothing more needs to be said about that. You will recall that extensive reference was made to the tweet which appears at 221, and this again comes from Mr. Ndozi. And this is in reference to the Vodacom issue. And I'll show Your Ladyship exactly what the facts are around Vodacom. Fighters, don't be surprised when Vodacom gathers journalists to strategize on how to deal with the EFF. It just means our fight is right where it belongs, in the belly of the beast, white monopoly capitalism. Hashtag white monopoly capitalism. They would not be doing well if they were not all uniting against us as a jig. There is no hate speech here against anybody. There is not even a creation of an atmosphere of abuse. What he is simply saying is that we are pressing the right buttons, and we should continue pressing the right buttons, because that is why even Vodacom is opening up a platform for our criticism. Now, my lady, you remember the debate yesterday about whether context matters at all. We know context matters because of paragraph 27 of the Masuku case at page 59, where the Supreme Court of Appeal says these statements also failed to be interpreted within the context of the speech and the circumstances attended at the place and time they were made. What was the Vodacom context? Because you remember, the suggestion is the EFF called upon its supporters to react to Vodacom. The Vodacom stores were trashed, and therefore we fear that we will also be beaten up. We know for a fact that the EFF says in the answering affidavit in relation to the Vodacom issue, at page 379, paragraph 349, this is what Mr. Malema says. I point out to the court that 6 individuals who purported to act in the interest of the EFF when causing damage to a Vodacom store in Polokwane were held personally accountable for their unlawful conduct. Neither the EFF nor I were held accountable for such conduct. The EFF as a political party and me as its leader should not be held vicariously liable for conduct over which we have no control, and in any event have encouraged our supporters not to engage in. 20th of November 2018, Mr. Malema said violence is for the empty-headed. The EFF will thrive on superior logic. They expressly called against violence. And they specifically say those individuals who trashed the store bore the consequences of their conduct. We know this as well because the newspapers that have been attached, newspaper articles attached to the application, 224 in particular, and at MD13. This is what the newspaper says. 6 arrested for quote-unquote EFF Polokwane Vodacom store damages. And then it says, The police said they could not confirm the political affiliation of the suspects who handed themselves over to the police on Thursday. 6 people have apparently handed themselves over to police in connection with damages caused to a Vodacom shop at a mall at the weekend. And then he says he added that the police were still continuing with their investigation. So even the police, who are primarily charged with conducting the investigation, said they couldn't confirm the membership. And it's quite easy for anybody to trash a store and steal a couple of cell phones using Mr. Malema's name, in conflict with what Mr. Malema has said, where he has expressly said violence is not for us. And then at page 226, how that story ended, the Vodacom story. Is Vodacom and the EFF had their own discussion. They then issued a joint statement saying, as far as we are concerned, the dispute is over. It is now resurrected by journalists who are not involved in the dispute. So we see the statement at page 226 to 227. And what the statement says, the 4th paragraph. In the meeting, the parties discussed the matter in detail and have resolved the issue. Vodacom acknowledged that it is politically neutral and it doesn't influence party political positions in any way. Vodacom and EFF appreciate that the matter could have been handled differently to avoid the misunderstanding that occurred, the EFF and Vodacom said in a joint statement. Page 227, the parties said they encourage the right to freedom of speech and the free circulation of ideas. The EFF and Vodacom also committed to engage on policy issues of mutual interest and considered the matter now closed. That is how it ended. 6 people decided to trash a Vodacom store. No doubt they stole a couple of cell phones. The EFF and Vodacom took the responsible line. They had a meeting, they discussed, they resolved their misunderstanding, they issued a joint statement. So the attempt now at dragging that issue up and then putting it somehow as evidence of the, I think someone called it the violent streak of the EFF, is really to stretch the bounds of credibility beyond breaking point. And so that context is crucial for understanding the tweet at page 221. And understanding the tweet at 251 by Thengiwe Mkhaliphi, who is the Deputy Secretary General, where she says, Vodacom have declared a war against the EFF, let's go. Let's see who will win this war. Fighters, let's go. What we know is that there were in fact protests, but those were protests outside of the stores of Vodacom. And the right to protest is in the Constitution, provided it is not done violently. And so there would be no problem at all with Ms. Mkhaliphi says there is a war declared, let's go. Because that simply is a call to protesting at the stores of Vodacom. And as a matter of fact, those people who exceeded the bounds of peaceful protests got themselves locked up, and no one actually knows what their political membership is. Then, Your Ladyship, you were referred to 247. Now, that's the retweet. What we know about the retweet is that it is a retweet by Mr. Malema. But we also know his explanation about retweeting. Yes, at page 380, paragraph 355.1. This is what is in the answering affidavit, an explanation about the retweet. Now we remember that Mr. Barry Bateman accused Mr. Malema of endorsing the tweet. Mr. Malema says in paragraph 354, the insinuation of Mr. Bateman is denied, expressly denied. 355.1, I said nothing further in respect of the retweeted statement. My silence cannot be construed to mean anything further, particularly where doing so would have unlawful consequences. He expressly distances himself from the endorsement. I regularly retweet tweets that I both agree and disagree with. A retweet is not an endorsement or akin to a like on Facebook. Instead, it is a means of drawing attention to something that you may see by showing it to the people who follow you. That need not mean that the contents of the tweet is endorsed. That is the explanation he gives in the answering affidavit. And then he continues the following page at 381, 355.3. It is common practice on Twitter that various persons include a disclosure in the description of themselves that features on their Twitter homepage. While I do not have such a disclosure, it is frequently the case that people say things like likes and retweets, not endorsements. This is done for various other reasons other than to show agreement with a particular tweet. In consequence, the court should reject Mr. Bateman's attempt to dress up my retweeting a tweet as evidence of a breach of the Equality Act. So this is expressly denied, and it is explained fully that retweeting is not endorsement. But we know on the facts that this was immediately deleted at any rate, shortly after the retweet. But context matters, my lady. Context matters because we are told so at paragraph 27 of the Masuku case. What actually happened here, so that we don't have a skewed and a narrow understanding. Mr. Jacques Paul tweeted what at the time was understood to be the address, the actual picture, with an arrow showing the house of Mr. Malema. I know SANEF says that they objected to it and they distanced themselves to it. But the fact is that it was tweeted. Yes, and the point that Mr. Malema himself actually makes at 379, page 351, says, although Mr. Bateman records the unlawful and unethical conduct of Mr. Paul in publicly sharing what he believed to be my home address, together with an aerial picture of the house, it serves to demonstrate that journalists, including some of the complainants, do not conduct themselves according to the ethical standards that one expects. I mean, Mr. Paul acted as a journalist, widely condemned by the journalistic community. And the fact is that Mr. Malema's house was tweeted by a journalist, not published in the Sunday Times newspaper, but on Twitter. So Twitter is a platform that journalists themselves use to communicate issues that express their opinions and issues that do not necessarily are newsworthy. My colleague points out to me that when Mr. Paul deleted a tweet and no one complained, but Mr. Malema unretweeted this tweet, and that too is held against him. But the point of the matter is that in the answering affidavit, Mr. Malema explains that a retweet is not an endorsement. And when I retweet, I am not endorsing. And that it is common practice on Twitter that people will press the like button or the retweet button, and that has no implication of endorsement at all. But nevertheless, what does the retweet say? 247, a list of Stratcom journalists' home addresses would be a good Christmas present. That, of course, is wrong. No one should be going around looking for the home addresses of journalists. But it is not hate speech under Section 10. I've dealt with the tweet at page 251 by Ms. Mkhalid, and I've showed the full context of the Vodacom story and the rather opportunistic nature in which it has been parachuted into these proceedings. Then, my lady, in the replying affidavit from Mr. Basson at page 513, again, something was made of this in the main address. Remember, what had happened is that the Black Land Fest organization had said something that are awful about killing of journalists. Someone else who purports to be an EFF supporter then says, for the first time, I actually agree with Mr. Mutambo. Again, that's crucial to draw that distinction, that it's not the EFF that is the original source of the threatening tweet. It is Mr. Mutambo. And a third party then says, I agree with him. Mr. Basson then raises this issue and then says upon Mr. Malema, I've opened an intimidation case against, a criminal case of intimidation against an EFF supporter threatening to kill me. Very unprofessional. The SAPS is very unprofessional and very professional rather, sorry. And I will assist them in tracking down the suspect. No condemnation yet from the EFF. And then Mr. Malema says, we won't do it. The question then that arises is whether that response, we won't do it, constitutes hate speech. The answer is manifestly no. The mere fact that the EFF refuses to condemn someone who is behaving crazy does not mean the EFF is committing hate speech. The same thing, that tweet goes on to page 514, where Mr. Basson says, well, what won't you do? And Mr. Malema responds, condemnation, as we will condemn no one. But it simply doesn't constitute hate speech as defined in section 10. Now, my lady, this is the full extent of the tweets by the EFF itself. This is the full extent of the tweets that would fall under section 10 of the Equality Act. Why this in-depth analysis is important is to ensure that we do not blur the lines, we do not attribute legal liability where the statute doesn't impose it. What picture do we get out of these tweets? There are big messages we get from tweets. The overall message is that the EFF is extremely unhappy with journalists that have taken political sides. But the way it has decided to respond is what Mr. Malema calls superior logic, what Mr. Shivambu calls clarify cogently with facts, they fall on their sword. That is the dominant, most reasonable construction of the actual conduct of the EFF. What is the position of the EFF on violence? Not only did the answering affidavit expressly repudiate violence, the very first speech that brought us to court on the 20th of November, Mr. Malema made his position clear on violence. That clarity on violence has been repeated many times by the leaders of the EFF. Mr. Shivambu has repeated it. Mr. Ndosi has repeated it. And Ms. Mateus says we are entitled to respond whenever we feel we are criticized. Mr. Mpofu's tweets are also quite clear that do not lie publicly and say you phoned me. Do not lie and say you sent me questions. You didn't. All of that is perfectly legitimate, protected by Section 16 of the Constitution, which the EFF relies upon also to propagate its message. But most importantly for our purposes, my lady, it's not an infringement of Section 10 of the Equality Act. This is where our learned friends then move on to another cause of action. And then they say, well, if you did not directly commit hate speech or violate Section 10, then you are guilty of violating Section 11, harassment. No, my lady, I think I still have 3 minutes. My junior probably thinks I've spoken too long. So he's reminding me that it's tea time. Yes, I still have 3 minutes. Let me use it. Let me use it, ladies. Thank you.
All right, there you go, Advocate Tembeka Nqukaitobi representing the EFF, and starting off by saying that there's a danger in choosing profession by profession for protection. That was his line. But he went on to talk about the various tweets, the controversial tweets that we've been talking about. And, you know, he says the criticism in these tweets is that the journalists are propagandists and it's not hate speech.
Yeah, we all await to see how this pans out.
Yeah.
That contest with the SANEF at the courts?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. He also spoke about, you know, as a bit of a defense for Julius Malema, saying that violence, and he quotes some of the wording in one of the tweets, saying violence is for those empty in the head. So they're basically arguing that it shows that Mr. Malema is expressly opposed to violence. So some of his arguments there. Also, the phrase that we all remember is chopping the head of the enemy. Yeah,
yep.
And he says
that's the
this
one
is
that got them to court.
Metaphorical speech, according to them, and says that we must be tolerant of robust speech. And something that I also picked up that is quite interesting with regards to the retweeting, saying that Mr. Malema is saying that a retweet is not an endorsement. It's merely drawing attention to something in the public domain.
What do you think?
To a group identified by one of the more of the prohibited grounds. Now again, you go back to the prohibited grounds. This is unlike, my lady, a situation where the language of the Act, like in section 10, says any other ground. This is a situation where you must fit in the grounds themselves. So you must sex, gender, sexual orientation. None of those apply. Membership to a group identified by one or more of the prohibited grounds. So you must be within a group that is identified by one or more of the prohibited grounds. So if we look at what are those groups: race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, ethnic, social origin, color, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, conscience, belief, culture, language, birth, HIV status. This case does not fall within those because there is no characteristic that they can point out that is linked to the characteristics in B, in A, which is prohibited ground. Because the language of section 11 is quite clear that, the language of the definition of harassment is quite clear that you have to be identified by one or more of the prohibited grounds or a characteristic associated with such group. In fact, my lady, the language in the definition of harassment tracks the jurisprudence because it focuses on this innate characteristic. What it doesn't do is the leap of logic that SANEF is edging upon the court, which is ignore the prohibited grounds and simply adopt occupation or journalism as an exception or a prohibited ground. See, there's lots of activity behind me, but the time is also 11. The time is also 11:15. I probably have no more than 20 minutes to continue, and then my colleague will then do the strikeout. The two of you. I see
this one is prohibited on.
David is seated at the back of the room, man. David is seated at the back of the room.
Yeah, how are you? Good and you? Yeah, we don't need to say your name.
It's like worked like a permanent child. Johnny came up and
Can I be out of this?
You just click in the Bible.
chapter 16.
That's a good
Jesus Christ says to his favorite disciples, and he says disciples, that's how we
Nazir? You phone me? Yeah, we must do a letter, eh? Yeah, okay, I'll give you a ring. Yeah, I'll give you a ring. Okay.
No one
person. It is only responsible for what it does. But your leadership does not need to go into dealing or into the law of voluntary associations like a political party, because your leadership has the statute. The statute tells you that the liability is imposed by the statute directly on the EFF. And the form of derivative, which is really what this case has ultimately turned out to be, it's a derivative attribution of liability to the EFF for conduct of third parties. There is no legal principle at all that has been cited to your leadership. What you have been told in order to derive liability are three things. First, you've been told that SANEF tried to meet with Mr. Malema and Mr. Malema refused. Second, you have been told that at some point Mr. Malema retweeted one message and some of the EFF members somehow spoke in ways that can be construed as endorsing the conduct of third parties. And then you were referred to the tweet by the DSG who said, tweet us, let's go in relation to Vodacom. Now, I've given your leadership a full exposition of the Vodacom saga, where it began and where it ended, to illustrate that it is taken completely out of context and that the reference to the Vodacom scenario is a misconception. Insofar as the retweet, we've looked at the answering affidavit. We know that this is +1 evidence, and we know that Mr. Malema's version is to be taken. Then, insofar as the failure, and that is the point that was made in relation to the failure to meet with SANEF and the failure to condemn. Can I say one thing up front? On the papers, what we know for sure is that the official position of the EFF, and it's not a position that is held in Mr. Malema's head, the official position that has been communicated publicly is that the EFF is opposed to any form of violence. But we also know that it's not only physical violence that they are opposed to, they are also opposed to online abuse. And the reason we know that is because both the president, Mr. Malema, and the deputy president, Mr. Shivambu, have told their supporters on Twitter publicly that the way we engage with these journalists is superior logic. Those are the words of Mr. Malema. Mr. Shivambu has said the way we engage with confused journalists is clarify them with facts and they fall on their sword. You've heard a lot yesterday about how the EFF has never communicated publicly that its stance around journalists is that it is opposed to online abuse. That is simply not borne out by the evidence. On the very facts that have been presented by the journalists themselves, it's clear that the EFF has publicly communicated its position on violence and its position on online abuse. Not only has it done that, it's also told its supporters how to respond to what it perceives as provocation. Superior logic, clarifying with facts cogently, and people will fall on their swords. This is the world in which the EFF lives in. It is only by distorting those languages, it is by distorting that world, that one comes to the conclusion that somehow the EFF has created an environment of hostility. Because factually, one is simply unable to come to the conclusion that they have created an environment of hostility. That's the first point, is that the official position that has been communicated, not once, not twice, more than 3 times by the EFF, is one of using superior logic. But there is also another problem. Every EFF speaker that has been cited, EFF Twitterer that has been cited, it's clear what they've said. There is not a single one of the EFF tweets that is a call to violence, that is a call to online abuse, or that is a call to misogyny, and all of the things that have been complained about. So no one, my ladies, in their right mind, reading those EFF tweets can interpret them as a call to violence. No one. No one reading what Malema said can interpret that as a call to violence. So we move from the direct liability of the EFF into the indirect or derivative liability of the EFF. But even there, we have to postulate a reasonable person reading and understanding what the EFF said. It is just logically impossible to think that anyone who read every tweet, I read 15 tweets from the EFF. Anyone reading those tweets would think that the EFF endorses violence. It's completely illogical. That's the second point. The third point, which again needs to be articulated consistently with the first one, is that the EFF is in fact opposed to online abuse. Quite apart from what we've been debating today and yesterday, which is whether or not a cause of action has been established by Section 10 and Section 11. We've shown your leadership that Section 10 and Section 11 do not help the applicants. But that perhaps is an irrelevant debate, because of course online abuse is bad, and especially online abuse that is done by reference to misogynistic terms. It's wrong to call Ms. Van Veek the things she was called on Twitter. It's wrong to call Ms. Msami the things she was called on Twitter. No one promotes that. In fact, the EFF expressly condemns it. But we have had 2 days of an attempt by SANEF to scapegoat the EFF. That too is wrong. The truth of the matter is that it's not difficult to identify a troll, an online abuser. If SANEF says they cannot identify them, why do they think the EFF can? If SANEF was serious about what it wanted to do, it would have taken all of the names of the Twitterers, all of the names of the people that had abused them, and put them as respondents. It doesn't want to do that because the EFF is an easy punchback. Because we know everyone, because they all have Twitter handles. And it's not as if it is impossible to sue them, because you sue them by reference to their Twitter handle, and there's a court order which is capable of enforcement. They decided not to do that. And your leadership must ask, you reflect back and say, forget about the legalities, they have been debated. What actually is at stake here? Are we not running the risk of just silencing the EFF because perhaps the message is not conducive? Are we not scapegoating the EFF because perhaps the message is not suitable? And so there is the ultimate context to the case, which is a dangerous context. And this is why actually on costs, the leadership should simply order no cost in this thing, because there are just no winners to this. The EFF is fighting against journalists. The people with real political power are sitting happily. I'm saying that your leadership should simply order no cost in this thing, because there are really no winners here. Whether you dismiss this application, it's a misconceived application on the law, but it serves no broader public purpose at all. To try and silence the EFF serves no one, because this simply avoids where the real political power is. It simply avoids what the EFF was trying to do all along, which is to hold power accountable. The small political party is doing what it can for democracy. Now, I've shown your leadership, Section 10, Section 11 are out of the equation. I've shown your leadership that the larger context to it simply calls upon, if you have any discretion, the larger context to it simply shows that you have to dismiss the case. We have also been told that there is a separate claim for an interdict. Now, let me clarify this here. There can be no separate claim for an interdict if the elements of Section 10 and Section 11 are not proven. Because the departure point for an interdict is a clear right. If they fail on Section 10 and Section 11, they cannot establish a clear right under Section 16 of the Constitution, because that immediately takes them to a problem of subsidiarity. And you are a creature of statute established directly by the Equality Act, and the function of this court is to enforce the Equality Act. And so any attempt at arguing outside the strict parameters of the legislation is misconceived from the onset. And so your leadership does not have to waste your leadership's time. Is that if they are out of 10 and 11, the case ought to be dismissed, period. Then your leadership, you were told that if there is no cause of action under Section 10 and 11, you can wear the head of the High Court, which it's baffling to say the least, that proposition. because you've brought us to court, to the Equality Court. Then accept that the consequences of failure to prove a cause of action is that you lose the case. You cannot want to win even where you lose. I've told your leadership that you have to take into account, this is now the final submission of the merits. You have to take into account the contribution of some of these journalists. They complain about the climate of toxicity. I've shown you that if you apply the lens of the law strictly, 10 and 11, that toxicity, if it exists, Mr. Berger's term was creation of a hostile or toxic environment. If that climate exists, it's not a climate attributable solely to the EFF. It's a climate also attributable in part to the contributions of the some of these journalists. We extrapolated these writings, and we know this because Mr. Passon says in the replying affidavit, when it's at page 510, paragraph 6.5. Now, of course, I don't make the submission that he's speaking for every journalist, because someone, for instance, like Ms. Van Veek, has not expressed opinion, she's just reported about VBS. Says 6.5, Mr. Malema conflates the two forms of journalism, news reporting and opinion. As auditor of News 24, I am also regarded as an opinion maker. I write a weekly column in which I express my views on matters of politics or current affairs. And then he says, in my columns, I am not required to be neutral in the same way I am required to be fair in news reporting. So he expressly accepts that he is entitled to be biased when he is giving an opinion. And one must be reasonable about this. You are the EFF. Today there is a journalist that is meant to reflect on a rally of the EFF. And at the same time, that same journalist has told you that if I do an opinion, I can be biased against you. That level of openly admitted bias must receive an equal measure of repudiation from the EFF. Because we know they say they don't have to be neutral. Why would they expect the EFF to be quiet? Why this matters as a matter of law is that context, of course, is everything. What this case was about, my lady, was a heated political season. End of 2018, with elections looming in May of 2019. The EFF is contesting elections. Mr. Malema is standing for president of the country. What he sees is journalists coalescing around common positions, but against the EFF. Coalescing around Mr. Boda, around Mr. Ramaphosa, but against the positions of the EFF. In that context, it is a heated context. One must accept the nature of the speech that sometimes transcends what we would regard as civilized discourse. Because it is a matter of political life and death for the EFF if they do not get voted into office, partly as a consequence of the writings of journalists who have told us on affidavit that they don't have to be neutral when they are writing opinions which are against the EFF. We've extrapolated for your leadership the articles. Your leadership, I don't have to read them. Your leadership can read them whenever your leadership is writing the judgment. You will see, my lady, for yourself, how this, especially Mr. Basson and Ms. Munusami, you will see how they have taken a standpoint that is critical of the EFF in what they call opinion pieces. You will see some of the writings by Mr. Dupree, which are critical of the EFF. You will also see, because we cannot complain about people criticizing the EFF, but you will also see people promoting Mr. Godard and promoting the so-called the new dawn of Mr. Ramaphosa. What are they expecting? Because the readers who read this will obviously be influenced because they take the journalists seriously. And on their version, I mean, this is why Mr. Shibambu says we actually don't care about newspapers because we will communicate on social media. So in that context of a heated political contestation, it must be accepted that the EFF will respond sometimes in kind. And I've shown you on the facts the way the EFF has responded breaches no law. It's hard language, hard-hitting language, but it breaches no law. So if your ladyship wants to have regard to this, it's 180 and 181, 386, 390, 394, 397, 400, 402, 405. This is just a sample that Mr. Malema was able to collect when he did the answering affidavit. He said, look at these articles, read them for yourself. And when Mr. Asson is challenged about it, he says it's because I don't have to be neutral when I'm doing an opinion. No one says he should be neutral. We accept that as an opinion maker, he's entitled not to be neutral. But the point we are asserting is that we are equally entitled to deal with him as a non-neutral journalist. So that is the point we make about the contribution of journalists. Not in the atmosphere of hate speech, but in the context of the hard-hitting language that the leaders of the EFF have used. That takes me then to the question of relief. Now, I've shown your leadership that there is no relief that can be granted to the applicants because the only logical thing is to dismiss the application. There is also no basis on which you can wear these two hats because we've been called before the Equality Court, and if there is no case, it must simply be dismissed. And if there is any relief that can be granted, one must have regard to the Karima Brown case, where the judge expressly took into account the contribution of Ms. Brown to the creation of the hostile relationship with the EFF. That she, like the current journalists we are dealing with, had been writing articles critical of the EFF and articles promoting. It's one thing about being critical of the EFF, but it is another to promote Mr. Ramaphosa and another to promote Mr. Kodan. And the court in that case specifically took into account her own contribution. But the overall context of the Brown case, Ms. Brown case, is dealt with in our note for oral argument. Page 14, yes, of the note we headed up yesterday. At paragraph 33 of that note, what the complainants failed to appreciate is that the facts of the Brown case are distinguishable to this case. Brown was decided in respect of the Electoral Code of Conduct, which creates a positive obligation for political parties to take all reasonable steps to ensure that their members and supporters do not engage in any conduct that amounts to the harassment of journalists. There is just no similar code here. And it's easy to understand why in the Electoral Code such an obligation must exist, because it is about elections. And in order to ensure there is a free and fair election under Section 19 of the Constitution, you have to impose an obligation on political parties to make sure that the media is able to report freely and fairly. So I submit with respect that Brown is utterly inapposite. The EFF was found to have violated the specific provisions of the code. It was not a general case that can be put in a back pocket and used every time you are unable to establish a cause of action under the Equality Act. It was a case tailor-made for an election. And here, it emphasized that there is no basis on which under the Equality Court, under the Equality Act, we can be held liable. What should your leadership do about the trolls? We are equally appalled by the conduct of the trolls. Mr. Malema says so in the affidavit. He says so on his tweets. He said so in his speech. But those trolls are clearly abusing the EFF. And if anyone wanted to stop them, they could have been brought to court as respondents, even as a class of respondents, so that there is a specific order against them. Trolls, we know from the facts, are also reported on Twitter, and accounts are sometimes deregistered. So it is not as if one is dealing with a scenario that cannot be helped other than imposing this extended liability upon the EFF. Because as a matter of fact, all of those Twitter handles could have been made respondents in this case, and the order would have been binding and capable of execution against them. But the choice was not to bring them to court. But then one must accept the consequences of that choice. But insofar as the EFF is concerned, it is as appalled at the abuse as the complainants. Its statement with Vodacom was so clear. We also support freedom of expression and the freedom of the media. Mr. Malema's statements were clear. So you only have to avoid, ignore the reality to come to the conclusion that we've been asked upon to do here. So we'll say that there is absolutely nothing stopping anyone from bringing these trolls to court and getting an order against them, getting them deregistered, getting a specific order against them, even in terms of the Equality Act, they can still be brought to court and an order can be sought against them. But insofar as this is a derivative form of vicarious liability, it simply fails to meet the test. That takes me to costs. I've already made the point clear to your leadership. This type of litigation, there are no winners. I hear what Mr. Berger is saying about punitive costs, etc., but it's truly irrelevant. There's no basis for punitive costs here. SANEF is acting in the public interest. We've shown that they've breached their own constitution by coming to court. But in reality, they are acting in the public interest. Mr. Malema is acting in the public interest. This is an equality court case. And to ask for costs in those situations, I mean, this simply makes no sense at all. And we must also look at the position of both of these parties. SANEF says that it's promoting the interests of journalists. Mr. Malema says that he's promoting the interests of a small opposition party. So why would costs be relevant there at all? So it really doesn't matter if you find for us or you find for SANEF. There are no winners in this case. You must simply dismiss the case with no order as to costs. That, of course, doesn't leave these journalists with no recourse, if that is the impression that is left from what I've been telling the leadership. It leaves them with ample recourses. Recourses under the Equality Act, recourses as a straight interdict, and recourses on Twitter, because all of us object to the abuse of journalists through social media. We understand perfectly what they mean. And we are, in fact, on their side that there should be no criticism, which is unfair, misogynistic, and that sometimes uses female genitalia to describe them. We are as appalled about those as they are. And so the dismissal of this case is simply a reflection that the case is legally misconceived. It is not an endorsement or a support for the continued harassment of journalists. And so your leadership should not feel that there is somehow a moral compulsion to fine for them if they are outside the parameters of the Act, because they have all of these other remedies that they can explore. And of course, if they want to work with the EFF in identifying trolls, etc., well, Mr. Malema is in court. And so, my lady, what then really remains of us?
Starting route to 7.
Someone got lost. What really remains of us is for my learned friend, Mr. Premit, to move the strikeout application. I've argued the case on the basis that all of the facts are before your leadership and they are part and parcel of the factual matrix. Thank you, madam.
I've read the room for oral opinion as it relates to the amicus curiae. I don't think there's anything you want to add.
No, my lady. Look, what shouldn't be unfair to our learned friends for the amicus. We appreciate the work they've done on unearthing the international authorities. And it's helpful to highlight all of those international authorities. I think the case, though, is a little bit narrower than they have. This is a narrow case about Section 10 and Section 11. So, your leadership, feel free to have regard to what they have said. They have been helpful to the court. And I know the position of the amicus. I've been one in many cases. So we would say your lordship should feel free to have regard to what they say. But it's ultimately not decisive on the narrow case that is before your ladyship.
And one thing before you sit down, insofar as the applicant's relief is concerned, I've read that the answering affidavit of Mr. Malema was an apology.
Yes.
There was an apology in the answering affidavit.
Yes, he did.
And in the answering affidavit, because one of the relief prayed for is an apology from the respondents.
Yes, no, he did say so. In fact, the issue of the apology, you remember that it was also in the Brown case. Mr. Malema says, of course, that insofar as they are offended, because the offense does not have to qualify as hate speech. But of course, it's acceptable that they may be offended. You may be offended by being called Satan, for instance. Yeah, and Mr. Malema apologizes for that. And this is the point we make, is that there is in fact no conflict about the basic premise that journalists must function independently, freely. And that is why it was not difficult to extract an apology from him. That yes, if you are offended because I called you Satan, I apologize.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, my lady. My lady, before I begin addressing you on the strikeout application, might I, for the purposes of housekeeping, just give your ladyship certain references in the record which are relevant to the strikeout application. My lady, the strikeout notice can be found in volume 4, pages 464 to 469. And the issue of the strikeout is canvassed in the following portions of the record. In the answering affidavit, it's section D, which is volume 3, pages 303 to 331. In the Mahlase replying affidavit, volume 5, pages 472 to 499. In the EFF heads of argument, pages 31 to 58. And in the EFF's heads of argument, my lady, it's pages 31 to 58. What that's regard to is sections F, G, and J in the heads of argument. And then in SANEF's heads of argument in pages 18 to 22. My lady, before I address you, I just want to make one side note about the relevant portions of the record. My learned friend, Mr. Nkaitobi, has already addressed you about the individual complainants and their failure to have authorized Ms. Mahlase to properly litigate on their behalf. And that's also the case that emanates from the replying affidavits. They all have a general statement in the replying affidavit which says something to the effect that I confirm the Mahlase replying affidavit to the extent it relates to me. Nothing about the opposition then to the strikeout application as properly filed before the court. So to the extent that it's necessary, the starting point for me is actually rather simple, and to say to your ladyship that as so far as the individuals are concerned, the strikeout application is unopposed. But be that as it may, and with a certain amount of generosity to my learned friends, I'm going to address you as though it were opposed. So my lady, my learned friend Mr. Nkaitobi has addressed your ladyship on what the true liability is insofar as the respondents in this case is concerned. And that's also the starting point of the prejudice suffered by the EFF in these proceedings. Because if the complainants had proper regard to the meaning and the express terms of sections 10 and 11 of the Equality Act, then the papers would not have been as extensive as they are, and they would not have been littered with what I will submit to your ladyship in due course is entirely irrelevant considerations for your ladyship. The 15 tweets read out to you by my learned friend identify what the scope of the dispute is between the parties. And it would have been very easy for the file to have been much thinner before your ladyship had SANEF exercised some restraint, as well as the individual complainants exercised some restraint in coming to this court. Now, I know in the answering affidavit, the point is made to say that this is done spuriously, and that's the further leg of the prejudice. The reason that it's done is so that when my learned friend Mr. Berger is able to stand up in front of you, he's able to reference irrelevant tweets that create an impression in your ladyship's mind. Definitely not mine, my lady. Thank you, my lady. The point I'm making is that those tweets are included so that when submissions are being made to your ladyship, some of the most abhorrent things that appear from those annexures, but which, as Mr. Mugaitobi has demonstrated to your ladyship, have absolutely nothing to do with the position of our clients in these proceedings, is utilized to create a different kind of hostile environment. And it's used to create an environment in this court as though the EFF stands by all of those statements and endorses them, when nothing could be further from the truth. So right at the very outset to your ladyship, the point is this, is that if my learned friend Mr. Mugaitobi is correct as to what the dispute before your ladyship actually is, then ipso facto all of the things that are identified in the replying, in the strikeout notice must fall as being irrelevant, and for the reasons of prejudice that I've addressed to your ladyship. But insofar as that might not be the case, I'll nonetheless demonstrate to your ladyship why the strikeout application is good. So, my lady, the complainants advance two general grounds to your ladyship, and they say that this is the basis upon which your ladyship should refuse the strikeout application. In the first instance, they say to your ladyship that the Equality Court as such is not empowered to entertain a strikeout application, and I'll address that in a moment. And secondly, to the extent that your ladyship might be entitled to hear a strikeout application, they say to your ladyship, well, it's important nonetheless because it's important for the context of you to understand what's really the dispute in these proceedings. So my lady, if I may turn to the first issue as such, which is this argument that's developed before your ladyship in SANEF's heads of argument at page 19, paragraphs 50 and 51. And that's this idea that there are four legs to this argument, and I'll deal with them one by one. The first leg to SANEF's argument on the score is that in terms of section 6, in terms of section 4, subsection 1 of the Act, these cases take the form of an inquiry, and then they go on to say, relying on paragraph 6 in the Kwelane judgment, that a strikeout is not good because these cases must be processed expeditiously and informally. And they go on to emphasize this point about the Equality Court does not have the traditional and restrictive red tape in these matters. And so it's a kind of argument to say that, well, the EFF's strikeout application is misplaced because it's overly technical and that has no place in this court. But they're mistaken, my lady, for two different reasons. The first reason is in respect of what section 4.1 and of the Equality Act and the Kwelane judgment themselves refer to. They're not dealing with the tests that your ladyship must apply in application proceedings before your ladyship. They deal with the deviation of the rules of this court insofar as the expeditious enrollment of matters are concerned, and insofar as case management issues may be needed to be determined in a more expeditious manner that falls outside the uniform rules of court. So right at the very beginning, we say to your ladyship that they're just simply mistaken. Section 4.1 does not create a special species of inquiries that's going to be heard in the Equality Court that then disregards all the rules of evidence. As an aside, they contradict themselves because they ask your ladyship to have regard to the Plaskon-Evans rule and how your ladyship must resolve issues on affidavits. But your ladyship can't do that in circumstances where the other party in the proceeding says to you, hold on, before you resolve these conflicts, there's irrelevant matter on the papers and you must strike it out. So at the outset, we say they're in some difficulty. The next argument that's developed, my lady, is this extraordinary submission that Section 19 of the Equality Act somehow and in some way limits your ladyship's remit to only the matters contained therein. And this argument is developed in our learned friends' heads of argument at pages 19, paragraph 49, and again at page 21, paragraph 56. And the high watermark of their case, and I'm reading directly from their heads of argument. Well, before I do that, let me say that Section 19 pertains to rules and court proceedings, not inquiries. So to the extent that there's the separate species of inquiry that's developed, that's clearly without merit on the clear terms of Section 19, which they then rely on. But the high watermark of their case is they say this: we submit in any event that Section 19 of the Act does not in any event make provision for applications to strike out. But, my lady, that is completely without merit. Because if your ladyship goes to the authorities bundle of the EFF, and if your ladyship goes to section 19, which appears on page 72, a very basic exercise in interpretation tells your ladyship something completely different. Because the section says this. The section says, except as is otherwise provided for in this Act, the provisions of, and then it lists the Magistrates Court Act, the Supreme Court Act, and most importantly, and the rules made thereunder, as well as the rules made under the Rules Board for Courts of Law Act, apply with the necessary changes required by the context of Equality Court, and insofar as these specific provisions listed in Section 19 may determine. So to the extent that the argument is made to your ladyship quite extraordinarily, that somehow Section 19 carves out the ability for us as the EFF to rely on 615 as a rule of court to strike out, is without merit. The terms of the Equality Act itself tell you differently, rather. And, milady, this is not an abstract submission. Equality courts do this kind of thing all the time. And I'm going to refer your ladyship to two reported judgments of this division, where other judges have had regard to the uniform rules of court in the context of equality court proceedings. I apologize to your ladyship that we don't have copies of this, but for your ladyship to have the judgment is not important. It's for your ladyship to have the reference. The first one is AS versus Neotel, Pty Limited, 2019 Volume 1, SA 622 GJ. And that's a decision of your brother, His Lordship, Mr. Justice Spill. That case, milady, the judgment that I've referred to, was in the context of a special plea that was raised by the defendants in that matter, being Neotel. So as an aside, let me just make this remark. Special pleas are not regulated in terms of the Equality Act, but clearly here a special plea had been raised, and His Lordship Mr. Justice Spill saw no objection to being able to engage in the matter as it is. And what was that decision? That decision was a preliminary decision of the court in respect of jurisdiction. And what did the court say at paragraph 13.4 of the order? It said this: if the court has jurisdiction over any of the claims brought in the Equality Court, and then at paragraph 13.4 of that order, if the parties cannot agree how to use the uniform rules of court in pursuance of the purposes of the Equality Act, they will approach Judge Spill in chambers for directions, who will direct the parties on bringing interlocutory applications where necessary. The regime put in place by Justice Spill is no different to what we ask your ladyship to do here. The only difference is that we're allocated and we're running the strikeout application, which is ordinarily an interlocutory application, together with the merits, in order that the matter may be judiciously managed and heard together. But if His Lordship Justice Spill doesn't see any difficulty with further regulating interlocutory applications that may be brought in terms of the uniform rules of court, clearly the submission made to you by our learned friends in respect of section 19 is mistaken. But then let's go to the other judgment that they rely on. That's the one of Manon. And forgive me, my lady, I said it's two judgments of this division. It's one of this division and one of the Eastern Cape. But that matter was also regulated in terms of the uniform rule of court. There, the judge was called upon to make a determination of a point of law in terms of Rule 6.5, para D, sub-bracket 3, which was about how to determine matters where a point of law is raised between the parties, also not regulated in the Equality Act. The court in that decision had no difficulty determining the matter as it ordinarily would in terms of the uniform rules of court. So yet again, the submission that somehow strikeout applications are not applicable in these proceedings is wrong. And I can't be more generous than that. It's just actually wrong. And what's the final nail in the coffin insofar as this submission is concerned? Is that Section 19 creates a further carve-out in terms of the ordinary rules of court in respect of Section 30 of the Act. That may be found at pages 77 and 78 of the EFF's bundle. I tried to have a cursory count this morning of how many exceptions it creates, and it creates something like 14 or 15 or maybe even more exceptions. It goes up to paragraph X, which I think is 23. It's the 23rd letter in the alphabet. It creates 23 exceptions in respect of which the Minister of Justice may pass regulations which deviate from the ordinary rules of court and determine matters contained in that list. Your Ladyship can have a look at that list when Your Ladyship is determining the strikeout. Your Ladyship will see not one thing insofar as this court's substantive jurisdiction is concerned in the determination of evidence. And indeed, to the extent that our learned friends suggest that beyond what is already expressly said in the Act, there's some sort of implicit term which limits Your Ladyship's jurisdiction, that's also mistaken. This court, sitting as the Equality Court, which is clearly of high interest to everyone, milady, is a creature of statute. And so when this court is engaging its Equality Court jurisdiction, it's not empowered to have regard to its inherent or general jurisdiction. It's constrained by exactly what's limited in the statute itself. Which is why, for different reasons, and as my learned friend said to you, if a Section 10 breach cannot be established, then the interdict application fails. So, my lady, on that, on a generous extension of their argument, we know that is also incorrect. Now, I've already briefly touched on Plascon-Evans, as relied on by my learned friends, and that was at para 45, page 18 of their heads of argument. And what they say is that the respondents put up no positive facts. The respondents don't say much, and so you must determine this on the ordinary course in respect to Plascon-Evans, and the conclusion Your Ladyship must reach is that it must all be determined on their version. My lady, I've already told you that, firstly, that's just simply mistaken. Your Ladyship can't be called upon to determine what the dispute is on the papers when a party says to you that the papers themselves are fatally flawed because they contain irrelevant, extraneous, scandalous, vexatious allegations and annexures. So before Your Ladyship can descend into the arena, as it were, and exercise Your Ladyship's discretion insofar as how the conflicting versions such as they are must be resolved, Your Ladyship must separate the chaff from the whey. Your Ladyship must get rid of everything that does not belong in this application before Your Ladyship can be called upon to properly decide upon what is properly in this application. So that's why the strikeout application needs to succeed. And it's an argument which is not addressed. But then, my lady, there's also this fascinating and, to be quite honest, surprising argument that is made. Because in respect of the Munsami affidavit in particular, which is the one that the respondents were criticized about for wanting to refer to oral evidence, Miss Munsami affidavit. Thank you, lady. The Miss Munsami affidavit is concerned we're told by our learned friends that, you know, if this material is referred to oral evidence, it's not going to take the matter much further. It's, you know, it's, I'll read out for your ladyship in a little while what my learned friend Mr. Berger actually said. But the point is he says that, you know, this is all in the mix and it's not really important. But the point is this: the request to oral evidence was conditional upon your ladyship not granting the strikeout application. The reason the request for oral evidence is then made if the strikeout application is not successful is because the EFF says to you in Mr. Malema's affidavit, I have no knowledge of the allegations that are made. A referral to oral evidence may put me in greater light as to what exactly Ms. Munsami is talking about, and in consequence I may be able to respond thereto. But as the pleadings presently stand, it's evident that that's no good and that's not good enough. We can't be criticized on one hand for bringing the strikeout application when we say we don't know what this is about, and then on the other hand where we say, okay, if we're not allowed to bring the strikeout application or the strikeout application is dismissed, then we want to go to oral evidence because we need to understand what this is all about. We're still criticized. The applicants can't have it, or rather the complainants can't have it both ways, and they certainly can't try to steal a march on the respondents insofar as its reliance on the procedures that are available to it to protect itself. That's not a question of form, that's a question of substance. Why should the EFF be called upon to answer extraneous matter in respect of people that it doesn't know and it cannot identify? If we were to remove the similar facts outside the context of the Equality Act, your ladyship would have no hesitation in striking the matter from the record. Because it's not confirmed. Your ladyship debated that point with my learned friend Mr. Berger yesterday. He gave you a different answer, but the point is yes, it's not confirmed. Ordinarily, your ladyship would strike with no hesitation. This matter should be no different. And then, lastly, my lady, the last refuge, it seems, of the complainants on this notion that strikeout applications are not allowed is they sort of say, well, if they are allowed, in the alternative, your ladyship has a discretion to allow all of this matter in, and they reference three authorities in their heads of argument. Those three authorities are the National Coalition case, which is at paras 54.1, page 20, and they rely on that to say that your ladyship can have regard to all of this matter because it's important for context. Then on the same page at para 55.1, they rely on Afriforum versus Malema, and that's a decision of your brother Lamont J, if I'm not mistaken, and they rely particularly on the phrase evidence not normally permitted. So it's this idea that otherwise strikeable evidence must then be included because Lamont J included it. I'll address that in a second. And then over the page at para 55.2, they rely on Kwelane, and the emphasis there is that in the Kwelane judgment, the learned judge said, I allowed all kinds of extensive information to be determined in this matter. But milady, all of the reliance on those three cases is wrong. It doesn't take the argument further as to why the strikeout application should not be granted. If anything, it proves the opposite point. Insofar as context is concerned, my learned friend Mr. Ngulaitobi has already demonstrated the contradictory approach taken by the complainants. They want to airlift and analyze in vacuo particular tweets, particular annexures, particular phrases, particular words that suit their purpose, and then ignore everything else. In this case, they want, and in this case, the consequence of the inclusion of all of that irrelevant information is they want you to ignore what the actual words of the EFF and its leadership is, as read to you earlier this morning by my learned friend, and to have regard to all the extraneous matter and the people over whom the EFF exerts no control and no authority. So if your ladyship must rely on National Coalition case for context, the context is not that those tweets that they've attached to their papers are relevant, it's that it's irrelevant. Because the case that the EFF is being called to answer is squarely as against it, not as against third parties. And so when your ladyship has to determine what the proper context is, your ladyship does that by disregarding and striking out all of that spuriously included information. Because otherwise your ladyship then gets drawn into debates about things like vicarious liability or strict liability, as we've canvassed in the supplementary note, which is not what your ladyship is called upon to do here in an equality court proceeding. So on that score, they're out. Then let's look at what they say in respect of the AfriForum case. With respect to Lamont J. in that case, they've attempted to elevate Justice Lamont's decision, highly fact-specific decision in context, exercising his discretion as the presiding judge in that case, to a broad principle. That's not true. We know that judges are given a discretion and they respond to the same legal principle differently. That's part of the nature of being a judge. You're called upon, or the bench is called upon in the context to exercise its discretion. Of course, it might be persuasive that Lamont J. had regard to all of that other information, but that in no way serves to denude your ladyship of an exercise of a separate discretion. And we say that your ladyship is capable of exercising a separate discretion here because your ladyship can debate the underlying dispute between the parties without needing to resort to all of the additional information that has been added in. Your ladyship is in no way hobbled or in no way limited. Your ladyship is in no way hobbled or in no way limited from adjudicating the main dispute once you cut out all of the irrelevant information. And that leads to the conclusion with respect that your ladyship must cut out the irrelevant information and not let it stand as a matter of record. Milady, what the failure to strike out that irrelevant information will mean is that on the express terms of the case as pleaded by the complainant themselves, they failed to establish a cause of action. And why they perhaps want all of that irrelevant information in there is as a residual position. It's a vanguard position that they can attempt and motivate before your ladyship and say, all right, if we as the complainants didn't succeed, well, you can have regard to all of this irrelevant information, and the irrelevant information makes up the cause of action and makes the case for us. It's trite law that that's not how applications are determined in a court. So let me just address the Kwelane decision, because again, with respect, the Kwelane decision is of no assistance to the complainants. Because what does the learned judge say in Kwelane? The learned judge says, I've included all of this information. I've included all of this information because the purpose of doing so is to develop jurisprudence. The point is that the judge in Kwelane clearly considered that they were dealing with a novel issue and that they wanted to have regard to as much evidence as possible so that they can determine the underlying legal debate. Now, as my learned friend Mr. Gaitobi has told you, that extension of the clear terms of section 10 and 11 to somehow create a duty on the EFF is not before your ladyship. So your ladyship, with respect, is not engaged in a debate brought by SANEF as to whether or not you should, similarly to what happened in Kwelane, extend this court's jurisprudence. What the relief sought by SANEF tells you is that these things said by the EFF on these occasions constitutes hate speech. It's a cut and dry case with respect. And that demonstrates why all of the additional information added to the affidavits is irrelevant and ought to be struck out. And the prejudice we suffer as a consequence, well, our clients suffer as a consequence, is not only having to deal with all of this, we also have to spend a careful amount of time saying to your ladyship why your ladyship ought not to allow herself to be tempted to read in and determine issues that actually do not form part of the cause of action in these proceedings. So at this point, what have I said to your ladyship? I said that in respect of all of the arguments raised by the complainants, that a strikeout application cannot be brought in the Equality Court is completely wrong. Your ladyship is entitled to hear a strikeout application, and indeed we as the respondents are entitled to raise one, which is what we've done. So then let's assume that your ladyship is with me and that the strikeout application is then a live matter before your ladyship that your ladyship can actually determine. So then let's go on the application then of the strikeout to the facts of this case. But before I do so, I want to recall something that my learned friend Mr. Berger said yesterday in the course of discussing Ms. Munsami's affidavit with your ladyship. And if I'm mistaken in recalling what Mr. Berger says, I have no doubt that I will be corrected in reply. But in the context of defending Ms. Munsami's affidavit, he said the issues in Ms. Munsami's affidavit are so peripheral that they are not issues that warrant a referral to oral evidence. And later, what he went on to say is they might not be of consequence, or they might be of consequence. And your ladyship in those circumstances must give it the weight that it deserves. So right at the outset, I don't know whether my learned friend concedes then that all of the information objected to by the respondents is irrelevant, because remember what he says to you, it's peripheral. And it might be of consequence or might not be of consequence. That's not how pleadings works in this court. You come to court with all that is necessary, you attach it to your founding affidavit, you say here's the case, then comes the answer, then comes the reply. It's not you don't invite a judge on a fishing expedition in an affidavit with reams and reams of paper attached to it and say to the judge, well, it might be of consequence or it might not be of consequence, you make your mind up and I'll be bound by whatever you decide. So right out of the starting gate, they're in difficulty on the application then of the principles to the facts of this case. And also, my lady, may I just say this? They can't have it both ways. Because what the complainants say to us is that we, the respondents, must not resort to something like a strikeout application, which is so technical and is really legal point scoring. Because remember what they said to you earlier, this is an inquiry, it's an informal proceeding, your ladyship is not so constrained. But what do they seek in the relief? They don't seek in the relief for all of us to sit around a campfire and sing Kumbaya or something equally informal. They seek a final interdict against the respondents, curtailing their ability to say certain things, to tweet certain things, to share certain things on public platforms. They want and in order to do that, they have to get a declaration under Section 10 that hate speech has been established. So they can't have it both ways. If we're in an informal sing-song, that's fine. But then the relief must change. And so the application must be dismissed out of hand. But if we're not in an informal sing-song, and there are serious consequences that may flow from your ladyship's judgment, well then, for the reasons I've already said to your ladyship, it's quite clear that the respondents are entitled to bring the strikeout application as they've now done, and which, on the way in which the papers exist before your ladyship, is not opposed. And my lady, I started out at the beginning saying to your ladyship what the correct test is in a strikeout application. And I don't have to rehearse it, it's prejudice. It's whether or not the inclusion of all of that objected to material prejudices the party complaining about its inclusion. And I want to give your ladyship specific references in the EFF's heads of argument where we've quoted the relevant cases which set out the test. We quote the Varts case at pages, well, I'm saying page, it might actually be paragraph, if your ladyship will bear with me. No, it is pages, it's not paragraphs. At pages 53 and 54, we discussed the Vaught's case, which is the leading authority on the definition of irrelevant, vexatious matter. And we then give you, at page 56, we give you an extract from Swissborough, and then at pages 56 and 57, we give you the reference to Glenister. So in the first place, the point to be made to your ladyship is the type of prejudice that the respondents suffer in these circumstances is trial prejudice. We really don't know what case it is we're being called upon to meet here, because every time in the replying affidavits there's a slight shift in terms of the reliance of the section of the Act that is being relied upon, then the underlying evidence that is being relied upon, then it's the so-called hostile environment cause of action, all of which are very far away from the terms of Section 10, which is originally and apparently what this application was supposed to be about. So that's the prejudice we suffer. It's trial prejudice. But also, very importantly, milady, the authority of the Constitutional Court in Glenister is very important. And it's very important because it attenuates prejudice slightly beyond what it is we might ordinarily regard as prejudice. Sorry, Malay, I'm at page 56, para 196 of our heads. It's from Vaught's, not Glenister. But it's the bold portion of the quoted part of the paragraph. If a party is required to deal with scandalous or irrelevant matter, the main issue could be sidetracked. Well, we've demonstrated to your ladyship how that is the case. But if such matter is left unanswered, the innocent party may well be defamed. The retention of such matter would therefore be prejudicial to the innocent party. So in other words, if your ladyship, in the exercise of her discretion, chooses not to strike out the matter that we've complained of in our strikeout notice, the further prejudice created to the respondents is that that information remains of record in perpetuity, provided, I suppose, that the court file doesn't get lost. And the prejudice that is suffered by the respondents in those circumstances is that it looks to the world outside and the world at large as though your ladyship has laid her hand upon all of that irrelevant information and said it's fine. You can litigate like this, but also all of the content in there is acceptable in the context of this debate, in the context of this case. And surely that is not correct. Then, of course, there's the practical prejudice. And the practical prejudice is that apart from having to deal with hundreds of pages that are totally unnecessary, apart from having to bring a strikeout application and to detain the court perhaps longer than is needed, the fact of the matter is that, the matter itself is conducted under a cloud, and that's not appropriate either. My learned friend Mr. Berger, in submissions to your ladyship yesterday, went so far as saying something along these lines. He said, "I'm not making emotional submissions to your ladyship. I'm making objective submissions that are borne out by the papers." Well, my learned friend would not have to make such a qualification if all of the highly emotive and unnecessary material were included in the papers in the first place. And who did that? My learned friend's clients did that. So, to that extent, that's a further prejudice that the parties are faced with, or that the respondents are faced with, and would justify it being struck out. And the consequence of the strikeout application, milady, cannot be undermined, or undervalued, or underappreciated. Because the moment your ladyship draws a line through all of those matters, the moment your ladyship says none of that has proper context in these proceedings, well, then we know what happens to the cause of action. Because then, with respect, SANEF is at 6s and 7s as to what it is they're actually asking from your ladyship and what they're relying upon and what cause of action it is that they've brought here. It's entire sections of affidavits. It's entire affidavits. It's quite literally tens upon tens of annexures, all of which do nothing further to this matter, do nothing insofar as allowing your ladyship to properly exercise their discretion, and so in consequence deserve to be struck out as your ladyship would strike out matters in any other kind of case that your ladyship were called upon to adjudicate. That it may be an equality court matter, that it might have highly emotive underlying subject matter is irrelevant. The rules of court are incorporated into this matter. The strikeout application is before your ladyship, and your ladyship must strike out. And respectfully, it's as simple as that. Unless there's anything else from your ladyship, those are our submissions in that regard.
Yes, Milady. We can start at 2, and my learned friend Mr. Manchu will be dealing with the reply. As your ladyship.
I wanted to get some momentum. I wanted to say, listen, I want to finish my book.
I was rather hoping I'd be home by